Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 5. According to my understanding, Theosophy was assembled by Helena Blavatsky from random pieces of Eastern philosophy unlucky enough to succumb to her grasp. She then used those pieces to create a unified magic theory with no mathematical basis whatsoever, combining the worst parts of religion and philosophy. Do you remember how I said that some people believe tripe when it comes to wizards? They believe in tripe with all other sorts of magic too. Blavatsky certainly did. Her theory not only unified such ideas as the enlightened bodhisattvas and saints, but also included fairies and trolls in the mix. The result was a system of elegant imperfection, where the elegance captured the imagination and the imperfection got redefined as perfection. To the rich, Blavatsky propounded a wonderful theory. Souls don't go to heaven or hell. Instead, when a body dies, the soul is reborn into this world, its social status a direct measure of its spiritual status. Base souls would be born into base conditions, while the most spiritually advanced souls would be born into the highest classes. As the rich inherently had souls of higher status, they were in the best position to advance beyond their current human limitations, to reach a state where they would stop being reborn, beginning a process that would take them into a spiritual advancement far beyond what we knew on Earth. That also meant that those who were born rich were also born to rule, literally being born better than everyone else. However, the point of being born to a high status was not to live a high-status life. The point of being born spiritually advanced was to move to the next spiritual level, and you did that by acting in a way to show that you were ready. There were great spiritual teachers out there looking for new pupils, but they only chose those who acted with such selflessness that their virtue was undeniable. Only when so convinced would a teacher contact you, taking you on as a pupil, teaching you that which is unseen by the normal man. If the system left off there, it would simply be Buddhism, but Madame Blavatsky didn't stop there. Eastern philosophy existed as a diner for her hucksterism. She ordered the entire menu, dumping every dish into a large cauldron, then served it out as if it were a purposefully cooked dish, where the carrots and the pie and the pot roast were all supposed to be served together. The results seemed complex but proved mostly indigestible. To add insult to injury, the entire philosophy was seemingly revealed to Blavatsky by some sort of higher being or entity, which is about as far away from wizardry as you can get. Wizardry has always been well placed within the Western notions of natural philosophy, where all knowledge in the field could be demonstrated and reproduced. There is nothing secret. There is nothing sacred. There is nothing hidden. Wizardry is the exact opposite of theosophy, with its hidden meanings, its supposed revelations, and its embracing of all things occult. Spreading such ideas as theosophy felt like peeing on the altar. I felt like a blasphemer and a priest at the same time. I wasn't sure which was worse, the profaning of the altar or the profaning of my own soul. I thought about all this as the streetlights flashed by, throwing us through shadow and light. As Joe was deep in a game back at the house, Charlie drove, leaving me to my thoughts. When he stopped the car, I hardly felt ready, slipping out. Closing the car door seemed too loud on that quiet street. My key let me in, so I went upstairs. When I opened my room, I found Dot sobbing on my bed, still fully clothed. She creaked her eyes open at the sound, giving me a look somewhere between spite and hatred. "Where were you, Mr. Reliable?" "I had a party," I said, setting down the typewriter that the Baroness had loaned me. Dot gave me another look that only she could give, like a cat realizing that you were about to give it the wrong food. I cried my eyes out, you know. I knocked. You didn't answer. I had to jimmy the door open. I could see her doing that and I hated not being there for her. "I'm sorry. I couldn't get back." "Who are you doing?" she asked, never afraid to speak her mind. "I'm not doing anybody," I said, then had to stop. "But there is a girl." She still didn't smile, twisting herself around lustily. "So Mr. Oh-so-reliable is obsessed. It won't last, mister. Women will stab you in the back after they stab you in the heart. Trust me, I know women. They're worse than men. Is she playing hard to get?" "I don't know yet. I am." Dot fumbled about for her purse, fetching out a cigarette. "I'm going to miss you, you know. What do you think about that?" "I'm not your type anyway." Dot had been a tolerable enough friend, but I had no illusions about her personality. Even free, she wasn't my type. "You're the one steady thing in my life, John. I'd brotherize you if ministers did that. Now I'm back on my own. God knows where I'll be next week. I mean, Millie, she smells nice, but I'm not really sure she's worth the bother. How much do you pay for the room? Those jumps in topic were normal for Dot. I answered her question without pause. That's too rich for me. Still, maybe it's time that I moved on. I'm tired of these four walls. This town is too small for me. Maybe I'll find some sugar daddy and become his well-kept mistress. I don't have to like him. Throwing her arms around my neck, Dot pulled me down, planting a now lipstickless kiss onto my lips. You could have me, you know? You won't get kicked out. Boys don't have to care about their reputations. I knew a bad deal when I got one. No, Dot, no. I won't be your excuse. Grow up and break up with Millie yourself. Dot flipped me the bird. Damn you. Now I hope that forget it. You deserve what you get. That was Dot in her usual form. I now needed her out of my room. You need water. You never drink enough. Down to the kitchen we went because the last thing that I needed was Mrs. Wallace finding Dot in my room. Time for backgammon, I said, that being the only game she could play while she was sloshed. Somehow the circles and triangles on the board put her into a trance and kept her tranquil when nothing else could. Don't ask me about the scores. I'm a terrible backgammon player. Even drunk, Dot made a fool of me, but she never won, reliably falling asleep on the board. Mrs. Wallace showed up around sunrise and had me fire up the furnace while she made coffee for Dot. Despite being a Methodist, drinking was a vice that Mrs. Wallace tolerated, for a reason which I never understood, and one that she never did explain. Believing that I would sway her opinion towards prohibitionism if I brought up the subject, I kept my mouth shut. In many ways, Mrs. Wallace reminded me of my grandmother. She was born in a similar time in a similar place and had a similar ethos. The only thing that she didn't have was my grandmother's unrelenting determination. Mrs. Wallace was a Methodist, and while we were staying in her house, we were Methodist too. She herded the whole house as a group to church, trusting that some of the girls would go astray if left to walk on their own. If you really needed to skip church, Mrs. Wallace collected the fine from you so that she could pay it right away, even if the recorder didn't ask for it, which most didn't. The Methodists were too damned honest. Given that the girls couldn't afford this payout, they all chose to be up and ready for services. So after the madhouse that was 7 women all converging on the same mirrors, losing their shoes and in one case being unable to find her glasses, we strolled up to the church in a chattering mob. The puritanical Methodists were nothing like the puritanical Catholics. One day I will be properly able to describe the tedium and soul-sucking emptiness that is a Catholic service. Every aspect of this ritual had seemingly been inspired by the need to bore the observer into submission. Every piece of music had a flatness and evenness to it, like a bland food, easy to consume but impossible to enjoy. Then in the most sacred of all ritual blandnesses, the priest would stand and deliver his sermon in the same even tone, taking the caffeinated and well-slept congregation as a personal affront, droning on until he counted enough nodding heads to know that his drone was more powerful than the coffee. At that point, the remaining ritual started again, giving you some small promise that the tedium would soon end. If the Methodists had any advantage over the Catholics, they squandered it on more music and ear-grating organs. With Catholicism, at least you could get some good thinking done, as you did everything by rote. It was just like being in a bar as they played Whiskey in the Jar, with all hands banging out the refrain without a thought. In Methodism, you never really knew what they were going to sing, so you did your best to look like you were singing, even as you tried to find your place. Even with all that tedium, I would pick church over a blank piece of paper every time because it let me put off writing for that much longer. I didn't want to do this. The soul was willing but the flesh was not. A blank page is like despair or leads to despair, or possibly is a physical manifestation of despair itself. A version of self-torture, the blank page allows a writer to flagellate himself for failing at the very act that will save him. It's walking in a lucid dream, almost knowing that you're dreaming, and if you can say the words, "I'm dreaming," then you break the spell upon yourself. Where inspiration fails, ritual follows. You fill your pen. You sharpen your pencils. You clear your writing surface. You get a glass of water. Then you sit, and nothing. There is nothing. There is nothing before you or behind you. There is nothing inside of you. There is nothing pressing against you. You are the blank piece of paper. How could anything be there at all? You stare at that nothing until that utter lack of anything of pattern or style or beauty drives you into madness, your brain unable to comprehend the lack of images before it, until you must turn away or find yourself crushed in the lack of truth that hates you. God lied when he said fiat lux. Everything after that utterance is one of those absurdist theater pieces where the players go through seemingly coherent conversations, yet it all amounts to nothing, yielding only a divine pointlessness. Life has no point. There is no purpose to our stories. We attend to our necessities and play in what time remains left over. We are like children going through all our stories day after day, and when the day is done, those stories are forgotten. They were never meant to go somewhere or anywhere. Just as light implies darkness and good implies evil, so hope implies despair. For some reason, we as adults have become convinced that stories must go somewhere. They must have a point. They must teach us a lesson. So here you are reading my story, and the only lesson that you will be learning is to not be Jack. What other lessons could you learn? You won't be me in my time or my place, you won't live my life, and you won't be put into my situations. So what is there to learn? All you really want to know is that I have a happy ending, or at least a content one. Yet we also read histories, engaged in stories where there is no point. There is no moral to the story. Men fight. Men die. Kingdoms rise and fall. Evil wins. Tyrants rule. Widows cry. The Book of Kings is brimming with these sorts of stories. We read about righteous kings of the Holy Land who live a few years, and unrighteous kings who rule for decades. As best as I can tell, being an unrighteous king paid pretty well and provided significant job security. And still that piece of paper before you is blank, more evil than the most unrighteous kings and kings, and more vile than that king who slew the babes. Despair. God save me from that blank piece of paper. In the end, I broke the dream and worked primal magic, just as the Jews had to paint blood over their doors. The act was one of self-preservation rather than expertise or entertainment. Just as quickly, I discarded those words. They saved me from madness, but in no way saved me from myself. When Thursday came around, Cymbeline drove Charlie's car over to the house and we took a drive. The weather had turned a bit bitter, but she kept the top down anyway. As we traveled, I mulled over what I would say to her. They were all lies, of course. They weren't lies in the strictest sense, but their intent was to fool her into thinking that I was more successful than I truly was. Lies are all about appearances. When the truth hurts you too much, you switch to something else, anything else. Pride insists on pride, not truth. Cymbeline found a grassy place by the river right next to the Coast Guard depot. The wind coming off the river bit through me, but she didn't seem to mind. How is the writing going? Nowhere, I said, daring the truth, then veering away. I've tried a zillion different ideas and none of them work. Some have potential, but they won't work as children's stories. I would love to write a story about a wizard on death row, remembering his life, but that would be more of a tell-all from the inside. Sordid, really. Not appropriate for children. Yes, I see. That would be a problem. Maybe I should write some true confessions of wizards. You know, make them into people. They would be hard-biting, just the kind of thing that the censors like, but the stories would also make them inhuman. Cymbeline shook her head at this. John, you're trying too hard. No wonder you aren't getting anywhere. I think that you should focus more on education. You keep telling me that nobody really has an idea of what wizards do. I think that these boys need to get the idea that wizardry is possible, and that it could be them doing that possibility. They could be that next famous wizard. They could do something new that nobody else could do before them, and that even science is powerless to replicate. What? Like see Jane summon. Summon Jane summon. No, not that silly. Really. Think about it. Boys pretend. They play cops and robbers. They play the parts of both cops and robbers. In order to play, they need to imagine themselves as the bad guys as well as the good. I think that you need the same elements in your stories. Give the boys something to play. Well, I'll see what I can do. And you also need girl wizards. We need women in wizardry as well. Since when? More theosophers wouldn't help anything. Since always. Women have always been magical just as much as men, just around the village instead. Who else do you call when your cow goes dry? That's not real magic. Not real? Of course it's real. Do you know anything about getting a cow to give milk? No. Did you ever study that? No. Did anybody ever study that? No. Then there's an entire branch of magic that nobody studied. I couldn't believe that for a moment, and I let it show. It's not worth studying. Her voice rose in pitch and intensity. But how do you know that? You don't. That's a prejudice. You don't study women's magic because it's women's magic, or Negro magic because it's Negro, or Red Indian magic because it's Red Indian. They don't work, that's why. Cymbeline gave me a look of disbelief. And that is the stuck-up attitude that got you wizards into trouble in the first place. At that time I believed that Cymbeline was absolutely and irredeemably wrong. I believe that all women have a magic inside of them called a uterus. It is the presence of this creative thing that distracts that tender sex to such unpredictable extremes. There is a power within them that drives them hither and thither, and ultimately provides the human race with more people. They are creatures of making and creating, which is why they are inappropriate as wizards. You don't train a little emotional time bomb to be a big emotional time bomb. These things have been tried. How many times do you need things to go badly? It might just be the system that's bad, not the woman. If women are tender traps, they sure do come with a lot of barbs and hooks. I'm afraid the rest of that picnic concluded with many awkward breaks in conversations and too much self-awareness. All the food had gotten cold anyway.